Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Keep It Clean webinar. I'm Heidi Dancho. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Canola Council in Winnipeg. And before we get started, I just wanted to quickly review the GoToWebinar system and show you how to participate in today's event. So the GoToWebinar interface is made up of two parts on your screen. So you'll see your viewer window on the left. So this allows you to see everything that the presenter will be sharing on their screen. And then you have the control panel on the right. And within that control panel is how you can participate in today's event. So we'll take a look at that. All phone lines will be muted, but during the presentation you can send questions to us through the questions pane. So you should see a questions pane there. Simply type in your question and click send. And at the end of the session, we'll do a 10-minute Q&A session to answer as many questions as we have time for. And if you're having any technical difficulties during the webinar, just please let us know either through the question pane or you can send an email. That address is info@keepingitclean.ca. And just to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording of the event will be posted on our website, which is keepingitclean.ca. So we have a lot to cover today, so we'll begin. We have three panelists with us today. Each will be speaking on tips to produce market-ready crops, the importance of market access, and some specific market access issues for their respective commodities. So I'd like to welcome Brian Innes, who's the Vice President of Public Affairs at the Canola Council, Mac Ross, who's the Pulse Canada's Manager of Market Access and Trade Policy, and Cam Dahl, who's the President of Cereals Canada. So to start, Brian, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Heidi. What I'll do is provide a bit of background on the issue and how the importance of what producers do has an impact on market access, and describe a couple things in relation to canola that are really important at this time of year. So we'll start by moving to the next slide. And what I'm sure most of you on the phone are aware is that we've heard a lot about market access lately. There's been a lot of high-profile issues in the grain sector, whether that's pulses in India or durum wheat to Italy or canola to China. So market access has been in the news, and we've heard lots about these high-profile issues. But what's perhaps not always told is all the things that we can do to prevent market access issues. And during today's webinar, we want to talk about some of the important things we can do to prevent those issues from happening in the first place. So let's move to the next slide. I'm sure that folks on the phone are aware that we export a lot from Canada. But what you may not know is that we are an export powerhouse. For the commodities on the phone, we've got 90% of our canola going to export markets, 80% of our wheat, and over 80% of our pulses. It's a great opportunity for Canadian agriculture and our farmers to get the most from international markets. But it also means that we need to meet the needs of our customers and their governments around the world. We're not just producing for a Canadian audience with Canadian regulations, we're producing for an international group of customers and many countries' regulations as well. So let's move on to the next slide. Today we're going to be talking about the risks that we're seeing to market access from each of our commodities perspectives and what we can do to help mitigate those risks. And as we move to the next slide, what we'll understand is that this happens because the requirements for our customers are not always the same as the requirements that we have here in Canada according to our regulations. What's really important for us as exporters to continue getting value back to Canada from our export markets is that we have a strong reputation for our products and the safety and reliability of those products in export markets. And that means we need to continue to meet the needs of our customers and continue to meet the needs of their governments as well. So our reputation is very critical, and we need to think about the long-term interests of our sector by maintaining that reputation and preventing problems. Now, as we move to the next slide, I want to describe a little bit more about how our customers have their own specific regulations. So our customers and their governments can have different approaches to how they regulate the things we use in the grain sector. I'm sure it will come as a surprise to nobody on the phone that food is a highly regulated sector and a very emotional sector as well when it comes to consumers and the impact on producers, whether they're producers here in Canada or producers in our export markets. So food is a very highly regulated space. And as Canadian agriculture uses a lot of technology, this technology is sometimes regulated differently in Canada and our export markets. The things we focus on for the grain sector in Canada are three areas. The first one being pesticides and their residues. The second one being seed technology, whether that's biotechnology or plant breeding innovation. And the third area is plant diseases. So these are things that countries may regulate to protect their own crops. And in the case of what we're going to be talking about today, two examples are Blackleg and Fusarium. So what we're seeing in the world, which I think is important for us to see, is that technology is continuing to get more complex, and as a result, so are the regulatory environments for the things that we use in agriculture and the things that are sensitive to consumers and the governments of the countries that we send our products to. So things are becoming more complex, and the customers that we send our products to don't always have the same way of looking at this technology as we do here in Canada. So as we transition to the next slide, we're going to focus on one topic in a bit more detail so you can understand what's happening in the world and what that means for each of our crops and what we do here in Canada. We're going to be focusing on pesticide residues a little bit during this webinar, and I wanted to explain a little bit about what we're seeing around pesticide residue regulation in our export markets around the world. So let's move to the next slide. I'm sure many on the phone have heard about MRLs, or maximum residue limits, but it hasn't always been clear about what an MRL actually is, and I'm sure if we ask those on the phone, we might get different answers around what it actually is. So we wanted to describe a little bit for those participating what a maximum residue limit actually is. It's not a safety standard, and I think that's really important to recognize, but what it is a standard that shows that the product has been used according to the label. And what you'll see on your screen on the left-hand side shows you that the maximum residue limit is set far below what would be considered some level of safety threshold. So a maximum residue limit is really a standard set to show that when you use the product according to the label, you should have residues below that limit. And it's used primarily for trade purposes so that we can have a common understanding of what a product should contain what a crop should contain if a product was used as required. As we go to the next slide, I want to explain why this is becoming a bit more of an issue and why there's been a whole lot more focus on pesticide residues than there has been in the past. What we're seeing in the world through all of our interactions with our exporters and processors and customers around the world is that there are increasing standards and increasingly complex standards when it comes to pesticide residue limits. There is actually one system where we all have an international maximum residue limit, and that's called Codex. And that's an international level that's actually part of the World Trade Organization framework. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that despite having this international standard, we're seeing a lot of proliferation of national approaches or moving away from this international standard. So what you can see on the left in the pie chart is that there's a lot of different approaches that governments take around the world. So you can see that Codex is that light blue in the top left-hand corner, and that's only a small part of the whole pie. So instead of having that small blue part of the pie apply to the whole world, it's only applying to a part of the world, and then other countries are increasingly using their own standards, which makes it more complex. We're also seeing at the same time that testing is becoming more frequent and more sensitive. As my colleague on the phone likes to say, we can find almost anything anywhere. And as testing and technology increases, we can find smaller and smaller amounts of product, which at one time may have been there, but we couldn't determine it. And the last point I think is important for all of us in Canada when we think about pesticide residues. There is a lot of sensitivity when it comes to pesticide residues, and whether that's sensitivity driven by protectionism or sensitivity driven by consumer interests or consumer interest groups. It is a factor driving the attention of our customers to pesticide residues, and therefore it needs to drive what we do in Canada to ensure we're meeting the needs of our customers and doing what we can to prevent issues from arising by using products properly. Moving on to the next slide, I want to explain a little bit more about why this is such a serious issue for us and why the actions for all of us in the grain sector in Canada are important. There have been impacts on the sector when we've had challenges meeting customer requirements because of either pesticide residues or diseases. I won't focus a lot on this. I will say that these are 3 examples that have been higher profile, but there are also others that don't get the same profile but still have an impact, and I can assure you we also hear from our customers on a regular basis about the importance of this. The 3 that are mentioned on the slide are described there in detail, but what I'll just say briefly is that we have seen impacts in the past, in 2011 for glyphosate and a challenge with the European MRL or lack thereof. It had real costs for the industry until that was sorted out. And second of all, with cereals and glyphosate, there is sensitivity around this. There is activist pressure and increased focus by some customers. And thirdly, when it comes to canola and blackleg, this has been an issue of serious concern from the Chinese for at least 10 years, and a concern to prevent blackleg from being transferred from Canada to China. So there are concerns around these issues, and that's why doing what we can here in Canada to prevent these issues is really important. So let's move to the next slide. This is really what this webinar is about, is what are we doing as a sector to prevent these issues from becoming problems for our industry and to mitigate the risk that is caused by the issues around the regulation of pesticides and other things. So what can we do to prevent these risks? What we are doing is working together through the Keep It Clean campaign. We're working together from across the crop sector, including cereals and pulses and canola. What we're doing is we're working together to ensure that we're doing what we can on the farm to implement the best practices that we know are the best way to mitigate risk to prevent that risk from affecting the whole sector. So we're taking a joint approach across the industry. We're trying to be as efficient and as effective as possible and reaching the tens of thousands of growers across the country because their actions are very, very critical in ensuring we're doing what's required to meet our export customers' regulations and their needs. So let's now move into 3 slides that are going to describe some key issues for canola. The first one I want to talk a little bit about is blackleg. And I want to describe to you a little bit more detail why it's important that we do what we can to manage the disease here in Canada. It's important, as I just mentioned, because there is concern from our export customers about this disease being transferred from Canada to China. We know we have blackleg in Canada, and that's been no secret. In fact, it's been something we've been working on for the last 10 years with China. But what we need to do is to do our best to manage it and prevent the risk from being transferred. So to manage it at this particular time of year, it's important that our growers understand through agronomists and through retailers that scouting for blackleg before swathing is a really critical part of managing blackleg. Helping growers understand what the amount of blackleg is that they have can really validate whether they're doing a good job of managing it. And there are a number of management techniques that we know we can put into action on the farm that can have a real impact to lower the incidence of blackleg. So this is good for the grower because it helps lower the impact of disease for them, but it also is really important for us to show to our export customers how we're taking action to minimize the risk. And you can see some of those actions on the screen, like planting resistant varieties, ensuring we're controlling volunteer canola and other host species that can make blackleg worse when canola is not planted. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about malathion. When it comes to storing canola, it's really critical that growers are only putting canola into bins that are free from malathion. And this is important because malathion, when used to treat bins for insects, can linger there and transfer onto the canola and then leave residues on canola. And that's a problem because we have a challenge in that our export customers do not accept any level of malathion in canola. So we need to have canola only stored in bins that are free from malathion, and that's not just treating your canola with malathion, but treating what was in the bin before it in the same season. So it's really important that growers understand that malathion should not be used in bins before canola is put into them. Moving on to the next slide, and this will be the last slide before I pass it on to my colleague. I wanted to touch briefly on another key practice that it's important growers understand, and we really want to help get the message out with your assistance in the agronomy space as well as the retailer space. This is around a pre-harvest glyphosate application. So when growers are using glyphosate pre-harvest, the label says that it needs to be applied when it's less than 30% moisture. And we want to help get the message out this year to help growers better understand what 30% moisture is, to ensure that if growers are using glyphosate pre-harvest, they're using it at the right time. And this is important because if they're not using it at the right time, it can result in higher residues, which can create a problem meeting the standards of our customers and their governments. So we need to make sure that pre-harvest glyphosate is only used at the right time. And you can see on your screen what that actually looks like in terms of seed color change. So what we'll be communicating this year, if you haven't seen it already, is that 30% moisture or less really means it's about 50 to 60% seed color change, very similar to the standard that growers are used to when it comes to swath timing. So this is the message we want to get out to really help ensure we're doing what's required in the field to prevent unacceptable residues of glyphosate from appearing in our canola. At this point, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Mac Ross, who will describe a few things of importance for the pulse sector. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Brian. And as Brian mentioned earlier, pulses, as are the other commodities, are very reliant on the export market. Pulses in the Canadian pulse industry exports over 85% of our production to feed the world. So open access to all our markets is critically important for the success of our industry. So naturally, the involvement in the Keep It Clean initiative with canola and cereals was a good way to help in ensuring that those markets stay open. And one of the objectives of Keep It Clean is really about linking the gap between the on-farm management practices to the marketability of a grower's crop. And we feel as a whole and as a cross-commodity initiative that in order to reach that objective, we really do need the help of product suppliers and trusted agronomic advisors like yourselves to get that message out. We're able to help identify some of these market risks and create the communications, but we don't have the type of touches with growers as many of you do on the phone. So I think, this is a really exciting opportunity for us to talk to a group like yourselves and hopefully be able to pass the torch a little bit and have you carry some of this messaging as well. So as far as the Canadian pulse industry's focus areas within Keep It Clean, most of which revolve around pesticide residues and the ripple effect of pesticide usage on the farm. So we can move to the next slide here. Might be a little delayed. There we go. So due to us having several types of pulse crops grown in Canada, combined with a number of different pesticides registered for use on each crop, recommendations on best practices and proper use can be quite complex. So on an earlier slide, Brian touched on an issue, a market access issue we had revolving around pesticide residues on lentils going into the EU, and that was in 2011, and that was a real eye-opening moment for the pulse industry and really was the genesis of our involvement in the Keep It Clean initiative. So in 2012, we started issuing grower advisories that illustrate the market risk associated with the crop protection products used on each pulse crop. So it tries to be a quick reference guide for growers to understand that, even if a product is registered for use here in Canada, there may be market risks in certain markets that the growers need to be aware of and that the rest of the value chain needs to be aware of as well. And this annual advisory that we formulate is done through a pulse industry working group that includes growers, exporters, processors of pulse crops, as well as agronomists and registrants of the crop protection products themselves. And every year this guide is available on keepingitclean.ca under the pulse section, and as are all of the resources that we'll talk about today are available on the website. So the grower advisory itself, as I move to the next slide here, so here you can see on the next slide, we've got a snapshot of what this grower advisory looks like. So like I said, we have a number of pulse crops that are grown in Canada, and you can see that across the top. So we have peas, lentils, chickpeas, and our different bean classes. And then we also have the products that may be of marketing concern to growers. And we try and give them a green, yellow, or a red designation. So green would be no regulatory issues and fine to use as long as you stick to the label and talk to your buyer. And yellow would be a caution, so meaning that there's at least one market where MRLs may not be established. So it's best to talk to your buyer prior to using that pesticide or crop protection product on the crop, as the buyer will really know the markets where those crops treated with those pesticides can be sold into. And then red just means that the product isn't registered for use. So moving to the next slide, one of the other focus areas that we have and main priority areas under Keep It Clean is glyphosate application, similar to that of what Brian talked to on canola. There's, and it's no surprise to anyone on the phone, the amount of scrutiny that the glyphosate has come under globally and in some of our key export markets. So it's really underscored the importance of following the labeled rate and labeled application timing. And for pulses, the specific focus is on application timing itself. So glyphosate must only be applied to all pulse crops when the seed moisture content is below 30% to prevent residues that are greater than the maximum allowable limits in markets around the world. And also it shouldn't be used, as it states on the label, it shouldn't be used as a desiccant or a tool to speed up harvest, but rather for pre-harvest weed control. And pulses specifically, we've seen some of our major markets like India and Pakistan, who historically hadn't tested a lot for any crop protection product residues, now start testing for glyphosate residues specifically. So as many of you know, Pulses have experienced other market access issues into some of those markets, specifically with India. So this, is the potential for another issue to arise, and we want to ensure that we're doing all we can to prevent that from happening. And the best way to do that is be real cognizant of the crop staging in Pulses prior to applying pre-harvest glyphosate. And this guide here on the left of your screen is available on keepingitclean.ca, and it is probably something that hopefully is useful to you as agronomic advisors when you're out working with growers and staging crops. And we know that it can be tough to assess 30% moisture, so that's where we've brought in some industry expertise to try and find some simple guides like this that can help aid in your recommendations to growers to ensure that they're doing what they can to maintain market access. And another focus that we have, along with canola under the Keep It Clean umbrella, is around PHI, or pre-harvest interval. And we know that that's a phrase that you know well, and that's the minimum number of days that must pass between the application of a product and the cutting of your crop by either harvesting or straight cutting, or swathing, that is. So there's a little video that's going up in the top left here, and this calculator is available online on keepingitclean.ca, and it sort of gives you two options as a one-stop shop for PHI recommendations for each product and each crop, each pulse crop and canola. So if you've already sprayed, you can calculate how long to wait until you can swath or cut. And if you do have a deadline and you haven't sprayed and want to find a pesticide to suit that timeline, there's also options there as well. So that's something that we hope that is used a little bit this year when growers are making their pre-harvest decisions. And again, all of this is available on the website. So I'll just, before I pass it off to Cam to touch on the cereal side of Keep It Clean, I just got one more slide, and really it's just kind of coming back to what we talked about at the start with our advisories, and how when we formulate our recommendations, it's really about balance and not completely eliminating trade risk. Brian talked about the complexities that exist out there in our export markets as far as different requirements. So really to try and make recommendations that would meet every market, the over 130 different markets that we export to, is really tough, and then we really end up recommending against use of certain products. So the focus is on balance and ensuring that growers have continued access to markets and crop protection technologies. So the question at the top there is not using this technology an acceptable long-term solution? And no, of course it's not. We know that the ability to use these new technologies has helped improve competitiveness, lower the cost of production for growers, and increase yield immensely over the past decade. So it's something that we want to ensure that we continue to have access to both these products and markets for our crops. And I've just got a quote at the bottom there from one of the growers who sits around our boards, and how he sums up this initiative as far as pulses go is that we want to be the ones continuing to make the agronomic decisions on our farm. So we want to make sure we're cognizant of the recommendations through Keep It Clean and some of the market risks prior to making our application decisions. And like I said off the start, we're really looking towards yourselves as the product suppliers and agronomic advisors to really help carry this message as well, because we're all in this together, and the profitability and success of our entire value chain is really linked to continued market access. So I'll just leave it there and then pass it along to Cam Dahl there to touch on the cereals aspect of Keep It Clean.
Thanks, Mac, and welcome everyone, and really appreciate you taking the time. And I want to reinforce a couple of comments that both Brian and Mac have made, and the first one is how important it is for you to help communicate these key messages back to producers, and directly linked with that is the, if I have a take-home message when talking about the Keep It Clean program, or to talk about why these conversations are important. It's because what happens on the farm really does matter in the international marketplace, and it has an impact on the value of Canadian crops. And I know often, and I've heard this from producers, and actually I've heard this from agronomists and retailers as well, is, we sell millions of tons a year. What happens on one or two sections in Saskatchewan or Alberta and Manitoba isn't going to make a difference, but it does. And the threat is very real, and we're seeing it in the marketplace today. And if you want to conceptualize what a part per billion is, it's 1 second in 32 years. And it's a very, very small number. A part per trillion is 1 second in 32,000 years. These are minute amounts, and these are the levels that we're looking at when we're talking about testing programs in international marketplaces. I'm going to touch my comments on three areas. I'm going to talk about pesticide residues with a particular focus on glyphosate. I'm also going to talk. Sorry, I understand I was muted. I'm going to. I apologize for that. I'm going to touch a little bit on three specific areas. One of those is going to be the pesticide residues, with some specific examples of glyphosate. Glyphosate is important for all of the commodities we're talking about today. I'm also going to touch on diseases in the field and some of the impacts that can have, and a specific example I think is quite timely on Dahl and Fusarium. And then I'm also going to touch on storage practices as well, and the need to ensure good storage practices to ensure marketability for products. So glyphosate, all of us have talked about glyphosate, and it is the product that the internet has come to love to hate, and it is under enormous pressure. We all know the value of glyphosate. We know the value of this product. But to be very blunt about it, if we don't use this product correctly, the marketplace is going to begin to take it away from us, and it's not going to be government regulations that limit the use of glyphosate. It is going to be our customers' demands, and so we really do need to get that message out to farmers that in order to keep this very valuable tool, we need to use it according to the label. And that message, and that applies to every pesticide that is available, is we really do have to rigorously follow the label, and that's one of the most critical messages of Keep It Clean. And why is that important? Well, we know that if glyphosate is applied to the plant prior to it being physiologically mature, that there is a risk that residues will be deposited in the seed. And there is a risk that will have an impact on the marketplace. So again, the message is similar to pulses and canola. Glyphosate is not a desiccant. It should not be applied to green crop to speed dry down. It is labeled for pre-harvest control of weeds. Things like thistle is a good example of weed control in fall. It should only be applied when the crop is 30% moisture or less. And again, that's when the crop is physiologically mature and we have reduced the risk of depositing residues. Specifically for wheat, again, it's that 30% maturity. For oats, we do have customers already that are indicating that they will not take oats if it has been applied for pre-harvest. So farmers do need to check with their marketer if they're considering using pre-harvest glyphosate on oats. And for barley, malt barley will not be accepted if it has been treated pre-harvest with glyphosate, and that is because the residues will impact the sproutability, and of course that makes it difficult to market or to malt. Sorry. Moving on a little bit, I'd like to talk about Fusarium and deoxynivalenol or DAWN as it's commonly known. I think I'm getting the slide changed, but I'll just wait a little bit. There we go. And again, here the key points on Fusarium or on glyphosate. Again, we've touched on these. Don't apply when the product is over 30% moisture, and do encourage your farmers to talk to their grain buyer prior to the use of full application of glyphosate. And again, I need to emphasize how important it is for you to help us get that message out. I've had the question come from farmers quite a few times on is it okay if just some of my low spots are green? Can I put on glyphosate then? And the answer is no. The product should not be applied if the greenest parts of the field are 30% moisture or above. And we really do need to start to deliver that message. Moving on to the next slide on Fusarium and to talk a little bit about DAWN. Deoxynivalenol is a mycotoxin. I'm going to talk about a couple of mycotoxins. DAWN is produced by Fusarium, and of course this is the time of year when farmers are scouting their fields and considering Fusarium treatments and fungicide treatments. It's produced by a fungus growing in the field. Parts per billion are the measurement that our customers are looking at when they're looking for DAWN infection. So it does have a significant potential impact on market access. We saw that a couple of years ago, back in I believe it was the 2013 and 14 harvest, where we had significant Fusarium infection, significantly high levels of DAWN, and crop that otherwise would have had significant commercial value was worthless and only available for salvage. So this is something that our customers do pay attention to. It's something that when I go around the world this in fall to talk about the Canadian crop, that we do get questions about DAWN levels in the crop. And so what can farmers do? Well, first off, grow resistant varieties. And of course, the time for that is past, but it still is a critically important message to deliver to farmers. The other is of course to scout fields and apply fungicide. It is very important to limit the spread of Fusarium, to limit the levels of DAWN that we see in the harvested crop. We need to, again, to get that message out to farmers that it's not just a commercial loss to them. It's not just a loss in yield, but the presence of the mycotoxin itself carries a significant market risk. And moving on to the second last slide, a little bit again to talk about Fusarium. is manage crop rotations. Fusarium does overwinter in stubble, so planting crop rotations that allow for adequate time for residues to decompose is important. So wheat on wheat on wheat on wheat is really not a good crop rotation, or wheat on barley. We really do need to see a break in the type of plants or the type of crops that are grown. And again, that's for the long-term sustainability for the production systems. Clean seed, of course, if farm safe seed is used, there's a risk of carrying the Fusarium fungus forward. So plant clean seed and consider seed treatment in high risk areas. Especially that will also help to improve the crop stand. And use all of these. It's the combination of best management practices to control Fusarium. Look at the Fusarium risk maps that the individual provincial commissions publish. Scout the fields, and again, be aware that this product or this disease is not just a matter for. It's not just impacting yield. It's not just impacting farmers' bottom lines. But it's impacting our ability to market our crop internationally. And I do want to touch a little bit on storage. And again, this is one where farmers do know that that grain should not be stored hot and wet. But sometimes falls makes that difficult, and we do need to get the crop into the bin. But it is an important message to deliver that it's not just the mold and the spoiled grain that you see visually that has a potential to have impact. But we do have funguses that grow inside the stored grain and continue to grow throughout the transportation and logistics to the final destination. And one of those is ochratoxin A. Ochratoxin A is produced by a fungus as well. This is also a fungal infection. And in this case, we are looking at parts per billion that the limits are placed on international markets. And we have had more than one occasion where we have had shipments and vessels rejected and markets closed because of the presence of ochratoxin A. And it does come about because grain is stored in high moisture and high temperature positions. So we really do need to ensure that grain is cooled, grain is dried to that area or to those levels that facilitate good storage. Some other points about storage and making sure that our product is ready for market. There is absolutely zero tolerance for treated seed. We do see that from time to time in export shipments. Bins need to be clean, and there is zero tolerance for treated seeds in export shipments. There's zero tolerances for things like blood and bone meal. So storage needs to be completely clean. I know that seems logical. But we do have cases where we're seeing contaminated shipments, and really do need to focus on that long-term storage. Store grain in cool and well ventilated, and of course monitor the condition regularly. That brings us to an end of the slide deck, and Heidi, will turn it over to you momentarily. But again, I do want to emphasize the importance of you helping us get this message out to producers that what happens on the farm matters. The advice that you give farmers matters, and we do need to protect our markets. We're in a world that is far more protectionist. We have countries that are looking for excuses to block trade. And these phytosanitary measures that we've talked about, all of our commodities are facing issues with them today. And so these are important messages in in a country that is as dependent on trade as Canada. So Heidi, with that, we'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Cam, and thanks, Brian and Mac. Now I think we'll give our participants a chance to ask some questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so blocked for questions here. So if you have any questions, again, please use that question pane and type in your question, hit submit. We'll be able to see it here and direct it accordingly. So please feel free to send your questions through. I do have one here. The question is, what if there's no maximum residue limit? Does that mean it's zero? Brian, you had talked about maximum residue limits earlier in the presentation, so did you want to maybe take that one?
Sure, thanks, Heidi. And the short answer is it depends. In some countries, when there's no maximum residue limit, they'll have a default level. And in some countries, they may actually informally or formally defer to another country or another MRL. So it depends on the country, and it depends on the chemical, and it depends on a number of factors. What I would say is that oftentimes, if there is no MRL, it essentially means that the tolerance is zero or the level of detection. And what we know about that level of detection is that it's getting lower all the time. What we've seen is that when there is a very low level of detection, or essentially a zero tolerance, that creates a lot of risk because obtaining zero is impossible. And while the risk may be low, it's not zero. So one of the issues we're all facing from a policy perspective is what happens when there are missing MRLs in our main markets, and what standard applies when there isn't an MRL, and is that standard really practical to accommodate a bulk handling system where our grains are going through the same country elevators, the same rail cars, the same terminals, the same ships, and in many cases going to the same facilities at our export destination as well. So from a policy perspective, it is a challenge, and we talk to governments regularly about that. What I would share is that this issue does come up with our customers and their governments, and it can be a challenge for us. We are working collectively as a grain sector on policy solutions in this area, primarily through the Canada Grains Council, but all the organizations involved on the call today have been active in the space to make that policy environment work better.
Great, thanks, Brian. That might be a good segue to our next question here. Any comment on traceability on glyphosate residue through elevator receiving points? Cam, is that something you might want to address or comment on?
Sure. I think that's a conversation you need to have with your elevator manager, but I will note that all the companies do keep samples, and it's good practice for farmers to keep samples of all their deliveries as well. As there's more and more scrutiny of products going forward in international markets, there's going to be more and more attention paid to what's delivered to elevator facilities. But again, looking back on this comment, I think I've had farmers say, well, what's my limit? How much glyphosate residue can I have that's acceptable? And looking at the market conditions that we have today, that really is the wrong question. And the right question is what can I do as a producer, and what can I do as an Agri-Retailer or an agronomist involved in the value chain to ensure that those residues are kept at an absolute minimal level. And of course, that's follow the label. And if the label is followed, those residues will be minimized.
Great, thank you, Cam. A question here: if I used a product last year, a crop protection product last year, am I okay to use it this year? Mac, maybe I could get you to answer that question just with the product advisory that you shared.
Sure, yeah, and thanks, Heidi, for the question. And I think as I touched on with our grower advisory, it's something that's issued annually, but it's also on the website because it can be sometimes a living document. But really, these complex and increasingly complex requirements of our customers are ever changing. So just because something is registered in Canada and it didn't present a market risk in a year prior doesn't mean always that the next year that'll be the case. So it's always best to ensure you're staying up to date with recommendations for each crop that are available on keepitclean.com.
Great, thank you. Another comment here is about fields with variable maturity. And the question is around, can I apply glyphosate when some areas are at 30% seed moisture? I think, Cam, you already kind of answered that in your comments around cereals, but Mac or Brian, did you want to touch on that for canola and pulse crops?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. This is Brian here. So on canola, we're certainly aware that this has been a challenging spring when it comes to emergence in certain areas of the prairies where crop can be separated by several weeks in maturity because of when the seed germinated. So whether it's this year or other years, it's really important, as Cam described, to think about the least mature part of the field and governing your use of pre-harvest glyphosate according to that least mature part of the field. So as Cam describes, that means that that least mature part of the field needs to be less than 30% seed moisture, because it will be that part of the field that will generate the residue. So it's important to think about that, especially this year when we know we've got delayed emergence and we've got crops at different stages in the same field, especially in canola this year. And it will be something we will be communicating more on as the season progresses, and we'd appreciate your help as agronomists and retailers to ensure that that message is getting out to growers as they manage what could potentially be a challenging harvest with crop at different stages in the same field.
Yeah, it's Mac here. I really, it's just echoing the same comments that, we understand that it can be quite challenging, and especially when you look at an indeterminate growth plant like lentils, right? It's very tough to stage 30% seed moisture all across a large field. So it's really ensuring that, like Cam and Brian said, the least mature part of the field or the greenest part of the field is at that required staging prior to application. And again, too, I think it's, just highlights the importance. You've heard it from each of our groups, the focus around proper timing around glyphosate. I think that's, too, is just a big takeaway from today is we just really want folks to be cognizant of the effect that improper use could have on the marketability of that grower's crop. And hopefully you see value as an agronomic advisor in, bolstering the advice you're giving farmers, the agronomic advice with, advice to ensure that they can continue to have access to markets around the world. So I think same thing to get back to the original question, that you really want to make sure that it's used according to label and wait till the least mature part of the field is under 30% seed moisture, and that you're not just using it as a product to dry down the crop and speed up your ability to harvest, because that's not what it is registered for.
Great, thanks both. Another question came through here. Do residue levels decrease during storage? Cam, did you want to maybe touch on that one?
Well, I'll just going back to just talking about glyphosate specifically, and if it's applied to a green crop, we're really seeing that that residue come from inside of the seed. So the quick answer is no, and often that doesn't occur because it's not something that is on the outside of the seed itself. So we can't plan for applying a product and thinking that 6 or 8 months from now that those residues will be reduced. And you can see that again. I'm going back to the recommendation on malt barley. If glyphosate is applied to a green barley crop and you try to sprout those seeds, they will sprout, and you come back 2 or 3 days later and they have all died. So that happens when you get residues that are simply too high.
Great, thank you. I haven't seen any more questions come in, and we're getting close to our 10-minute period here. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to send them through. But before we did close, I just wanted to go around and ask each of the panelists if they had anything to add or any final comments for our participants today. So Mac, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks Heidi. And well, first of all, I wanted to thank everyone for joining. I know it's a busy time of year for everybody, and it's spray season right now, so also timely for this discussion. But I thank you for taking some time out of your day to listen and to kind of get back to what we've all said and what Cam's really been emphasizing is that, you know, for the success of this communications program, we really need to rely on yourselves to help beat the drum on this, and really we want everyone to understand that we are all in this together, and that this needs to be an industry-wide approach as far as communicating the importance of using products properly and the importance of best management practices to ensure that our markets stay open, especially in the current trading environment when we're seeing things get a lot more competitive and a lot more, as Cam said, protectionist. It's imperative, and I know sometimes last week was talking with a grower who was asking, you know, we're sometimes it seems like we're putting the microscope on ourselves very much, but there's other export dependent countries out there that don't seem to be doing any of this. So, you know, why should we? And really, I think you kind of look back and look at this as an advantage that we may have in a more competitive marketplace and protectionist marketplace, that we are a country that's starting to look at this type of thing and ensure that we're making concrete strides to meet our export market requirements. And Brian touched on that right at the very start, that this program too and these discussions that we're having with growers in the industry is important to show our export customers how we're taking action to address these problems at the farm level. So I think it's a great initiative, and it's great that we're having these discussions, and that we hope that you can carry these discussions to the grower level as well throughout the year.
Great, thank you, Mac. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Just to build off what Mac said, partnership with you is incredibly important to help the sector continue to have export success. All of that export success depends upon us continuing to have market access, and what we're talking about today is what we can do to help mitigate any risks that we're seeing in these areas and continue to have market access to our customers. I'll finish by just outlining a bit of a quick story and how this can have an impact for many years. We've been with customers this week, and we've had significant discussions about what's happening with their regulations on pesticide residues and what we're doing here in Canada to ensure there won't be problems in their market when it comes to pesticide residues. So it's a very important thing for our customers, and wanted to relay that back to you today. But mostly what I wanted to share with you is that when we have incidents, it can have an immediate impact, but it can also have a long-term impact on our reputation. And I won't get into specifics, but what I will share is that during the course of our discussion with our customers this week, what came up was an incident with another country shipping to them that was about 10 years ago. And they keep talking about that and are concerned about that 10 years after that incident happened with another country supplier. So what we're talking about today is making sure we keep our market access but maintain our reputation, and those reputations for all of our commodities in our countries built up over many years and can take a long time to rebuild after it's damaged. So we appreciate your partnership in helping us achieve that objective.
Great, thanks, Brian. And Cam, I'll turn it back to you.
The Canadian brand reputation comes down to a really short few words, and that's the consistent delivery of clean, reliable quality. And that's not something that we kind of made up for ourselves. That comes back to us from our discussions and surveys of our customers on why they buy Canadian, why they might pay a little bit more, or if there was a choice of buying from another market that they would choose to buy Canadian. And just to continue on with Brian's idea, if we have damage to that brand, whether it's because of mycotoxins like DON or ochratoxin A, or pesticide residues, if that brand is damaged, that impact lasts for many years. And so we're protecting our markets today, but we're also protecting our markets for tomorrow. Again, if I could leave you with one thought, it's what happens on the farm really does matter in international markets, and we need your help to deliver that message.
Great, thanks everyone. We're just coming to 4 o'clock now, so I think that's all the time that we have for today. On behalf of the Canola Council, Cereals Canada, and Pulse Canada, I wanted to thank everyone for joining in today's event. If there was any questions remaining, make sure you follow at KIC Canada on Twitter. If we get any more questions, we'll be posting answers there, or feel free to send us an email. There's some contact information on keepingitclean.ca. And once again, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on the website, so you can check it out after and share with your colleagues, and just help share that with your grower customers as well, all of the tips that we've shared here today. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone again for their participation and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again.